Join us for a two-part interview with Dr. Dimitrios Tsivikros, a consumer psychologist and academic from University College London who specializes in understanding what makes consumers tick and how psychology can better be applied to creating advantage for businesses trying to win them over. If you're looking to launch a business or struggling to compete, this is one you'll want to watch.
I've seen genius ideas coming from small businesses, as the example that you just referred to as well. And I see those big, amazing, great names that, I've worked for a number of those people and they're fantastic. They're great people. But I think sometimes the size of their organization doesn't allow them to actually understand that innovation should be of service. It's not a privilege.
Okay, let's get into this. You're about to meet Dr. Dimitrios Tsivikros, a clinical psychologist whose specialty is in understanding consumer behavior. If you're in business, you're supposed to know the consumer is queen. But for a lot of companies, that's just a slogan on the wall. Consider this. The average person is connected to the internet 6.5 hours a day. In fact, there are some segments that are never disconnected. And while 86% of them will actively avoid advertising, they're super interested in content of value. But what do they value? Well, the answer to that question depends. It seems figuring it out has never been more important. According to a study by McKinsey, in the grocery category, the top 25% of manufacturers account for 60% of sales, but only 2% of category growth. In fact, 44% of growth comes from the next 400 manufacturers, companies that are often a fraction of the size of the category leaders. With large companies struggling to innovate and maintain relevance with consumers, and smaller, more agile upstarts stealing their market share, you don't need to look too far to realize that what's making the difference for the winners is their ability to fill a gap more effectively in the consumer's need state. Rather than simply seeing the numbers, Dimitri gets to the heart of what consumers find meaningful and what they really care about. And increasingly, commercial success will come by knowing that consumer best. As you could probably tell, I love this stuff. So let's talk to Dimitri. I would like to welcome somebody that I so admire and get excited by, the amazing Professor Dimitrios Tsivikros from University College London. I've had the pleasure of knowing Dimitri now for a number of years. He's given me some phenomenal advice, and I've always found his focus and his experience so amazingly helpful. And I think in this day and age where often the differentiator for a business is how profoundly it understands its consumer, that Dimitri's advice is going to be invaluable. So I just want to say thank you, Dimitri, for joining us.
No, the pleasure is all mine. And likewise, you've been an inspiration, a great collaborator. And every time that we do something together, I think there's a great synergy where ideas are flowing. And I think people can be, expect to be inspired to ignite a new idea. By no means we're going to be giving this, but I think we can have a great conversation to ignite ideas and new concepts.
Great. Thanks, Dee. So I want to start, Dimitri, I think when I met you, you were the first consumer psychologist I'd ever met. So can we start there? Tell us a little bit about your background and what was it that made you shift and prioritize a focus on consumers?
Sure. So I've studied psychology, and the majority of students who do study psychology are very much sort of thinking that they're gonna help people overcome depression or help people with some sort of mental condition and so on. Having said that, when I've graduated, I still had that idea. I'd love to actually doing, but given certain circumstances, I've realized that perhaps that's not my calling. I was not particularly good at it. I was not also strong enough. It takes a very special person to do it. So I have a great deal of respect for people who actually do work on the clinical side of psychology. So the second sort of component I was thinking of is just I love marketing. I love sort of visual communication. I love branding. So I was always thinking that clearly there must be something that I can offer there, given that I know how to work with people, understand them, study them, and so on. So then I went back to uni and I've studied statistics, and then I studied, a sort of a mixture between economics and psychology, which is commonly now known as behavioral economics from social psychology. So behavioral economics is almost there two camps: people that are coming from a pure economics background and people that are coming from a psychological background. And ever since I'm primarily an academic. I work at UCL and I've worked in other really, really great institutions before this. But also as academics, we are often asked to do work in the community. And I've worked with banks, with businesses, with consultancies, with accounting firms, and exactly that very concept of understanding consumers, their own reality, how they make decisions, and how we can, I suppose, empower both consumers and businesses to connect with each other on a better level.
So, thanks for that overview. How do companies typically engage you, and what are they often trying to get at? And if I can just add another aspect to this, full disclosure, I'm very cynical about the ability of large organizations to see their consumers anything other than abstract. They can collect data, but that's what they're seeing: data, not human beings anymore. That's what often a critique I make of large organizations. So to bring someone as specialized as you in would seem to indicate that they are pretty serious about wanting to get at something. So what are companies typically commissioning you to do, and what are they often looking to find?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the magic word that you've just mentioned is data, and you're absolutely right. Still, there are a number of businesses out there that they actually believe that data and people are just little words on a spreadsheet, or sort of concepts that they can be graphically represented, but nobody really understands what they are. So one of the first case scenarios that normally people come to me, they've done a lot of data collection and they've sort of, have numbers and so on. And they look at them and they go, we don't get it. What is this? And I think with social media, with a number of concepts now where people are actually being a lot more vocal about being happy or unhappy with a business or a brand, they are forced, not by choice, but they're forced by consumers, and rightly so, to give answers to people, to understand that consumers are a lot better. So the first sort of type of problem or challenge that they wish to resolve by hiring a consumer psychologist is to actually come to terms what that data actually means, how it can be interpreted, and I suppose helping them to create a framework to address some of the challenges that consumers are actually facing. Say, for instance, why certain consumers, when the brand believes this is the best brand that ever actually existed, still don't like it, they haven't adopted it, or they're not really happy with it. And I'm sure you've got plenty of experience in working with brands. At times, those brands or the developments are happening within silos, within brand development, executives, or people who are wonderful and they have the best intentions for the general public, but they have very little contact with the general public and the average consumer. So I'm not saying they're better or worse. I think they're out of touch with everyday concerns, anxieties, fears, and hopes of who we are as consumers. And what consumer psychologists do actually allow to build that bridge between the everyday consumer and those large organizations that are trying to reach out, but think they don't have the means, the skills, or the processes in place to build that bridge between reality and commercial opportunity.
Now, you and I have talked about this before, and a couple of years ago, I did a bunch of research looking at essentially instinct and creativity and where that exists within a large organization. So I remember, you said some brilliant things to me about how, as human beings, we are most comfortable in an environment in which we can control, or certainly feel like we can control things, control the outcomes. And that creativity, innovation requires you to leap, and that's where it becomes very uncomfortable. Remember that. It's really resonated with me because that was certainly an observation I made with a lot of large companies. So on the basis of what you just said, I'm curious about, so they finally realize that they've got an issue and that they need to go back out and try and re-understand or re-educate themselves about the humans that buy their products. But who's typically initiating those projects? And is it possible for your work to actually have effect if it's not being commissioned by the CEO of the organization so that it can be dictated and driven top down?
Yes, it's a good question. I think the majority of people who commission work that relates to consumer psychology are either people who work in in marketing, data analytics. So there are already new departments that they're hiring people that they sort of work within data, and they're incredible individuals in terms of collecting, managing the process, and distributing data to organizations. They're not particularly sharp yet interpreting. So that's what they actually need help with. There might be strategy departments that they're trying to build within HR and comms. So again, they're trying to understand, a number of organizations have worked with understanding their own employees. And they said, well, this worked really, really well. Can you help us to understand consumers now as well? Because let's not forget that employees are consumers of a certain brand, that, the brand that they work for, the business that they might be working for. So, and lastly, there are leaders that I think they're visionary to actually understand that their blind spot is that very that very understanding need and what products need to build first or next. At times, it's not product excellence that wins the greatest ideas, but it's just truly understanding what is needed. And what is needed requires an appreciation and full understanding of who the public is, who's your consumer, and what your consumer actually needs, rather than state that they need. I think also consumers, we are not clear communicators. We say one thing, but we do another. So it's just really reading between the lines as to what is actually intentionally in their behavior. And that's why consumer psychology come in, because we go above and beyond the medium of a survey. There's so many other tools out there to really pick up upon your intention versus your behavior. And that's the biggest thing that we've been able to help people with, understanding intention, what we intend to do as consumers, which I think marketeers are great in measuring. But what we're doing great is actually understanding the final behavior, what they're actually going to do.
Now, a couple of years ago, I conducted a bunch of research specifically looking at Fortune 500 companies. And at the time, what I discovered is that the majority of them were losing market share. And often they're losing market share to companies a fraction of their size, which, to be honest with you, is amazing. Because you think about Fortune 500 companies, they've got access to the best and the brightest from business schools, they've got market intelligence, they've got distribution, they've got all of these things working in their favor, and yet they are losing ground to companies a fraction of their size. And certainly we've seen all kinds of disruption, particularly with direct-to-consumer models, where you've got this kind of new generation of businesses that are not playing by the established rules of these larger competitors. So I'm curious, do you think that these large organizations have the ability to retool their thinking by using the kind of insights that you uncover for them? Like, in your experience, without naming names, do they really find a new understanding and do they act on it?
Mm-hmm. Very good question. I think they have an appreciation, and at times you do feel that you go and work with them because you are you really another box that they have to take. Oh, we've asked a professor about what's happening in academia, but clearly they don't know. We know, we have the people, we have the money, we have the resources. So at times you do feel that you are almost like the token spokesperson for a topic. However, there is a massive crisis upon people actually not trusting those big companies anymore. So I think they're listening to academics, or it's not just about academics, but listening to third parties that really urge them to understand consumers a lot better. And that will actually slowly, I see a great future for people who work in social sciences, just because we are needed. I think from global financial crisis to COVID to a great deal of, changes that everyone has actually experienced, has changed our DNA, has changed the way that we connect with each other. So we do need people who specialize upon that to advise businesses and consumers at the same time how to navigate this process. So yes, indeed. I think beforehand, I was just the prof that they needed. Now I think they do pay attention because they actually care about what people who are close to others have to say about them.
Interesting. Interesting. You were closer to the issue than I do now, but I spend so much time talking to entrepreneurs, and what I find so interesting is the difference between an entrepreneur and a leader. Obviously, entrepreneurs are often perceived as leaders, but I'm talking about leaders in the sense of those that exist within a larger organization. And I think that what I've observed is that, a lot of the great entrepreneurs seem to be compelled to do what they do. I've only met a handful that will say it's about the money. Most of them really feel like there is something bigger in the world, bigger within themselves that they need to tackle in the areas that they want to work with. In fact, I interview a lot of people who actually say I've walked away from money because I didn't want my life just to be about money, because I want to pursue something else. Now, when you get into the larger organization and you look at that leadership level, the thing I'm amazed by is just the fact that you've got executives who are compensated on short-term thinking. You've got finance, which has taken over such a leadership role. And with due respect to all of my finance colleagues, most of them simply are not that concerned, in my experience, with the consumer. And I just wonder, I'm often amazed at the kind of the silo effect where, as you say, there's a level of urgency now that requires companies to have this insight. But I just find that the structural issues within these organizations keep them from actually kind of really embedding it. There's no point in simply having marketing understand it, but having finance, as an example, not embrace it wholly. So I'm curious, have you noticed that, is there a growing appreciation that it's not simply enough for one department to take this information on board, that it needs to be an organizational-wide understanding?
I think you're absolutely right. I think different departments have different views upon what the market is, how to the extent that they need to know it. And I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of actually joining departments. One, of the key issues when we actually see companies not performing as well is just those cultural clashes between marketing and finance and strategy, where people are sort of, working in silos. I think at the moment, those walls have been renegotiated. People are actually reviewing again as to what is needed, who actually drives the business. And I think unless you're in a very specific industry out there, I think your audience should be at the very core, at the very driving seat as to your innovation, your how you run your business, and so on. And I think before that, I think the audience was there just to actually observe and offer help to, a product, a service, and so on. Now I think, we actually see that the audience is taking a place on the decision table, either via research, either by people who are actually coming in close contact with, and so on. So the more we bring the audience close to the very core of management, leadership, people are using different sort of terms for it, the more we'll understand that actually your consumers should be a part of your executive committee. If not leading it, because I think that might be biased, I think they should definitely have a chair on that decision table. Otherwise, I think you will no longer be relevant. And companies that are no longer relevant, sadly, don't perform as well.
That is a great point. And to be honest with you, I'm amazed that it isn't happening more quickly, because we are seeing levels of disruption now that we would not have seen before. I did a workshop recently, and I featured the example of these kind of discount razor brands that have gone, using a direct-to-consumer model, have gone to market. And the first one was a company out of the US called Dollar Shave Club. The first one of significance, certainly that I noted, came out about a decade ago. And that company, in 6 years, was acquired for $1 billion by Unilever. But they weren't even the biggest. There was another company called Harry's, which you may be familiar with. And, just to put in perspective, that level of disruption that I think is directly associated by having a deeper understanding of the consumer. At the time, I remember I listened to the chief marketing officer for Gillette talk about the launch of one of their new razors. And he was saying, we spent $200 million developing and now marketing this blade. $200 million. This company called Harry's comes along after Dollar Shave Club. They are now, they started, I think, a year after Dollar Shave Club. They're now the #1 selling men's razor brand in America. I mean, it's unbelievable with a fraction of the resources. And how did they do it? They knew the consumer. They bypassed this kind of focus on, using marketing as the lever. They started to focus more in terms of value and what they were offering to consumers. They were more intelligent in the way they went to market. And the result is massive disruption in a category that was seen as almost undisruptible 20 years ago. So I think that there are so many recent examples of the work that you do and its effect in businesses and what they can do to larger companies, but I still see it as it's a slow process. Anyway, enough about that. But the next question I want to bring up was, I remember a few years ago you were giving me some advice on a venture that I was working on, and the focus of this venture was basically creating meal solutions for moms. And you made this really interesting observation that I've never forgotten. You said, I want you to think about board games. I was like, board games? He said, yeah. What does a mom want most? She wants her family to get around the table. What does a board game do? And I just remember that so sparked a change in the way I was thinking about what we were trying to solve. I hope you enjoyed the first part of our interview with Dr. Dimitrios Tsivikros, a specialist in getting to the hearts and minds of consumers. Click on the second part of our interview to hear more about Dr. D's process for creating success on behalf of companies.